Rupert, how's it going, man?
I'm good, thanks.
So, thank you very much for talking to me, man.
No worries. Great to be here.
So yes, let's just get stuck straight in, man. How was your Fright Fest experience?
It was great, actually. I mean, it's pretty amazing to see 450 people packed into a theater on a Friday afternoon to watch a documentary. I've never seen that before, especially with one of mine.
Yes, yes, yes. That's brilliant. And did you learn anything? Like you're an avid horror film, or you're an avid horror fan. So, did you learn anything new about the horror genre when you were putting this together?
Loads. I wouldn't actually really call myself a avid horror fan, to be honest.
Okay,
I mean, not the entire genre, but especially not folk horror. I mean,
okay,
the sort of horror that I like tends to be more psychological, more thrillery, more paranoid, like whether it's Cronenberg or, Rosemary's Baby. I prefer the more heady stuff.
hmm,
Folk horror is really about, your neighbors. It's not
yes,
really
yes,
about you. It's
yeah, yeah.
who's the person behind the curtain. So it wasn't actually a genre that I really gravitated towards naturally. But I did watch The Wicker Man for the first time in 2022.
Uh-huh.
And it was just one of those films that you always mean to get round to watching.
Yes, of course.
And it was one of those. And I finally did watch it, and I was like, wow, this is a film actually about Britain today.
Yeah.
And I called a friend of mine, Tim Stanley, who's actually in the film, who's a journalist, and he said, well, this was all Wicker Man was inspired by a real murder, and that was kind of the beginning of the story.
Uh-huh. And can you elaborate a little bit on that there about how it sort of connects with Britain today and what how some things haven't changed maybe since 1945?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, the whole documentary kind of explores that in different ways, from different angles. But I think my immediate reaction was just that scene of Howie on the mountaintop where he's pleading for his life and he's like, don't you see, killing me isn't going to bring back your apples? And I just
Yes,
thought,
yes.
oh my God, that's me shouting at the television over the last 5 years about not just Brexit, but a whole host of bonkers ideas like Rwanda or whatever it might be.
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
whatever bonkers idea the government has come up with. And there's also, I think, with the UK as well, there's a hyper conformity in the culture, as much as we political culture, I mean, as much as we talk, and some of this is imported from America about, Britain being polarized. I mean, America's polarized. Britain might be polarized, might not be, but it's definitely not in Parliament.
Hmm.
Which political party is anti-Brexit? None of them, right?
Yes.
Every political party is now for Brexit, even though 60-70% of the country says it was a mistake.
Hmm.
Look at the action in Ukraine. Again, the majority of the public doesn't want British troops to go fight Russia, right?
Hmm.
That's not a popular sentiment. But yet, all of Parliament last week was like in Wicker Man, like, let's run over the mountaintop, all
Yeah.
together holding hands in some kind of mad suicide pact for war. And they've even adopted this phrase, the coalition of the willing, Keir Starmer has, which of course was a Bush phrase for the Iraq War, which not only was a colossal disaster, it also brought down Tony Blair's prime ministership. So we've got this sort of weird, irrational, cult-like political structure.
Hmm.
And that was initially what drew me to it. But of course, the more I got into folk horror and the more I got into the Walton case, there's all kinds of other ideas that kind of bubbled up, and I kind of let people watch the film to discover those for themselves. And again, the film is a bit of a gestalt.
Hmm.
So, we don't really put forward a super strong thesis on Britain and its relationship to folk horror. We let the audience make their own connections. We put out a lot of ideas, but we don't drum our own, we don't beat our own drum, so to speak, for one theory. And I think that's one of the nice things about releasing the film. People come up to me and they all have their own takeaways and their own experiences that they saw in the film, and that's to me what filmmaking's really about.
Did you see any like that's actually really interesting, man. I actually understand that a lot more. And you are right, I'm from like in over here in Ireland and we very much have all the same bullshit that we hear on the TV and everything, So I completely understand what you're saying there about a cult-like political following. You know, it's like you say jump, we say how high. You jump into a fire, we'll jump into a fire. You
Yeah,
know,
yeah.
and like how like you am I right to say that this like you are a documentary filmmaker? Have you made any sort of features, or has it just been primarily documentary now that you've been making?
I've been trying to make narrative features, but they're very hard to make. So I've got two in development at the moment, which we're casting up to different degrees, and I'd love to get those off the ground this year.
Hmm.
But I also love documentary. I mean, I come from a non-fiction background. My first career was in academia, so documentary seemed like a good bridge.
Hmm.
Um, and I think that, the documentary genre itself has changed over the last 10 years. It used to be 10 years ago, you would sort of go and follow people around with a camera.
Hmm.
That's just completely dead. I mean, there's no one is doing that anymore.
Yes,
So
yeah.
nobody will fund it. I mean, not that people don't want to do it, there's just no finance available to do that. It's too risky. And also, people are kind of just too self-aware now about documentaries and being on camera. You think about that great Frederick Wiseman tradition of just like being in a place for a year and just filming.
Hmm.
That's all kind of died. And we sort of moved into the kind of archive, mainly through the pandemic, actually, has been a kind of like an archive moment, because in the pandemic, no one could film anything. And I think that one of the benefits of that, which is not something I initially was necessarily drawn to, because of course you get into filmmaking because you want to go shoot stuff, is that you do actually begin to realize there is incredible archive out there and there are incredible um, uh, stories to be told that haven't been told. And there's also been a huge investment in rescanning everything. So in The Last Sacrifice, not only do we have a whole load of completely bonkers archive from the 1960s and 70s people have never seen before,
Yes.
that's just you have to just see. And people enjoy that bit of it the most, actually. The film people laugh at is all the real BBC documentary stuff about occult Britain in the 60s and 70s. But not just that, all the films have been rescanned and remastered recently. So you've got films like The Virgin Witch that just look absolutely stunning.
Hmm.
And so I think there's as much as we're in this archive moment, I think that there's a lot to do there. And I think this film was sort of my way of telling a story about Britain today, but really through our past.
And look, you're mentioning the archival footage, and that's something I wanted to touch on. Now, how hard was that, man? Like, even like as an avid film fan, I was watching this and I'm like, right, get a pen and fucking paper out here because there's stuff here I don't know about. How was getting the copyright to show all that stuff? Was it easy or was it?
No, it was a complete nightmare, and it took up, sadly, a huge amount of our time. Because you've got to research who owns the rights.
Hmm.
And so some of it we did license. Luckily, a lot of the Tigan materials, Tigan was a kind of competitor of Hammer's.
Okay.
So they did, Witchfinder General, The Blood on Satan's Claw, The Curse of the Crimson Altar. That stuff we all licensed was actually relatively inexpensive, interestingly. And then the problem with the Hammer titles was that sometimes the rights were split. They'd have like different rights holders for the UK and the US. And so that we just avoided and we just went through fair dealing. So we
Mhm.
actually used a lot less of that than we would have liked to than the start. But some of the films like Wicker Man, we were able to license from Studio Canal. Um, and some of the Hammer titles, like Demon of the Mind, we also were able to license. There was another one, I've forgotten which one it was. There was another Hammer title.
Devil
But
Ride
yeah,
out.
that's almost like the new art form of documentary making is just wrangling licensing and what
Hmm.
you fair use. And then, of course, the fair use rules are different in the UK, Europe, and the US. And you have to kind of
Yes.
cater it for all three markets potentially.
That's what sort of came into my mind when I was watching this. I was like, holy, like, this is, I'd be interested to find out because, I do cover a lot of films and the US distribution from UK and Ireland and stuff is also completely different. And people own this and they own that and you can't use
Sure.
it. Also, I want to touch on the editing. Now, I might have it, is it Alexander McNeil?
That's correct. Yeah.
Yes, yes. That is some tight editing, but there is a
Yeah.
lot going on as well.
Yeah.
So how was that? Were you sitting in with the editing and did you see how?
Well, it was sort of by design, really. I mean, I realized that, the Walton case, I mean, there was two things. One was it's old, it's 80 years old this year, and there's not really any visual material from 1945. And there's very little of early occult Britain as well. Not nothing, but very, very, very little. And because of what drew me to the case in the first place was its impact on folk horror, I just saw that as an opportunity, just from the get-go, of like, great, let's just tell the story using the movies that inspired, right? That's a really fun way. And my comp that I was thinking about in my head was like Room 237, the film on The Shining, that sort of
Yes.
does a version of that slightly differently, but they have their own kind of usage of Kubrick's films to tell the story of their theories of The Shining, and I wanted to do my own sort of version of that. And I thought, I wanted to have a very specific approach, and so I thought, what would be a great, who would be the right person to do this, just in the abstract? And I thought a trailer editor, because I
Hmm.
want somebody, because what do trailer editors do? They basically make films from other films. That's
Yes.
their job. And so I contacted Intermission Film, who would cut my first trailer, who are, the sort of premier indie film trailer house in London, marketing agency. Um, and I just said to them, I don't even know if you guys even produce films, but I've got this idea. Do you want to have a conversation? And very quickly they were like, we love this. This is great. They immediately saw it as like, yes, this is a great fit for us and our skill set and what we're into. And so the producer, Sam Cryer, from his many editors he employs, said, I think Alex is the right person to do this. And this was his first feature. And so we did work quite closely together, um, figuring out an editing style and editing approach. I don't want to take credit for it. It really is Alex's on the editing side. It really is his work on that front. But it was sort of fun developing it. For example, my initial idea was, okay, we're just going to lay down all of the horror films
Hmm.
to tell the story. And we did that, and it was fine. But Alex started experimenting with putting in other footage we were getting from archival producers of Britain that wasn't a horror movie, that was just actual Britain. And what we began realizing was that you actually couldn't tell the difference between the two in a lot of instances.
Uh,
So there's real footage of a house, a town in Britain, cottages that looks like it's Summer Isle, but it isn't.
yes.
It's just some other town in Britain. And we were actually, that's more unnerving if you actually don't know if it's the Wicker Man or it's real. And so Alex then started, to then look through that and kind of, you know, play off those ideas between, like, we have lots of scenes of pubs, for example. Is it American Werewolf in London? Is it a real pub? Is it the Wicker Man? It's not always clear which is
Yes.
which. And I think that was one thing that he really developed. And another part of that same process was we use quite a lot of flash frames. So it's a sort of film you really have to kind of watch because we'll just have a frame up because it's really a film about conspiracy and myth and rumor and gossip and the imagination
Yes.
and how this murder spurred all these imaginings about the murder. And we thought that was much more effective to just give you like this little kind of bursts of conspiracy than to sort of sit on them.
Hmm. And that's the music. Now, how did it come about that you got Mike Lindsay? Is it Tongue or Tongue? I don't know how they say it. Um, the Folktronic band. And
I don't know either. He was great. I mean, I didn't really give him a huge amount of direction. We gave him some sample tracks. My producer Sam Cryer found him, thought he'd be a great fit. My only note was no folk music,
oh
which
yeah,
sounded a bit counterintuitive, but it's what we got back was more interesting
yeah,
and great. I
definitely.
mean, we love it, and I think that it's going to be released as in vinyl actually at some
Right.
point. So
'Cause
if
I
you kind
think
of
it's
watch
very
our socials, we'll announce that in the next month or two.
oh, that's brilliant, man. Because I know someone will be buying that vinyl straight away. Seriously. But like I think that's a very good achievement because like the documentary spans decades and decades and decades, like as you say, like 80 years. And you're going to have music that fits the 1945 killing of Charles Walton. Then you're going to
Mhm.
have the music then that still can fit through all the folk horror and the occult thing. And it was a really, really good job and very dark, but it had my foot tapping quite a few times, man. So I look forward to the vinyl release of that now. So I will. And I interviewed a guy called David Luke Reese, and
Mhm.
you both, this is like weird. It's like you both had your premiere in Fright Fest on the exact same day. Just
Okay.
out of like it just happened this way. I'm both interviewing you on the exact same day, and the film that he directed is a British folk horror set in a quiet
Ah, okay.
little small English town with Wicker Man vibes, with kill list vibes, and then your documentary. So I think it strengthens the point or the fact that it's still very much alive and like, the folk horror genre is here to stay, really, It's like it's just as prominent as a slasher or a zombie film or, it has that weight now behind it.
Yeah, and I mean that's a sort of a question that we raise in the film is sort of why we don't necessarily really answer it, but it's a question that we raise, which is, why has this come back in the last decade, right? And
Mhm.
it's, I do think that, being on the filmmaking side of things, I mean, most films fail, right? Let's just be honest, right?
Mhm.
Most films don't make their money back, they don't reach an audience
Of course.
because the audiences are very picky.
Yeah.
They're flooded with options and they pick what they want, what resonates with them. And the only reason why you're seeing this avalanche of folk horror films is because there's something resonating with the audience,
Yeah.
right? If that wasn't the case, they wouldn't be there, I absolutely promise you. And so I think our question in the film is like, what is it about Brits that are obsessed with this paranoia that your neighbors are all mad and going to kill you?
Yeah.
Like, why is that
Yeah.
suddenly
Yeah.
like people are like nodding in the cinema, like, yeah, that I relate to this.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I think, as I said, we don't necessarily have an answer to that. I think that's more a question that we like to kind of throw back to the audience. Um, because obviously this isn't true throughout history. This isn't also necessarily true across culturally. I mean, there is a little bit of a folk horror revival in America, but nothing on the scale of like what's kind of coming
Mhm.
out in Britain.
Yeah. It's like I'd say every single English person, or even anybody that's just going on holiday to one of those small English towns, every single person, and I bet my life on it, has those thoughts when they're entering that little village. I'd say every single one of them are going, what if, you know, just what if, the doctor up there isn't really the doctor? He's like some like head of some pagan cult. And I think it's fascinating. Again, it sort of gives it this bit of mystique and, you know, it didn't happen that long ago, so it could be, it's
Well,
very much.
The English specifically, but I broaden it out to the British as well. They are very repressed people.
Mhm.
There's this sort of veneer of manners and politeness that people put a lot of importance in. That's a line in the film. One of our contributors says, Leah Latif. And I think that's the emphasis on surfaces is actually quite unique, really. I mean, the French are a bit like that, the
Mhm.
Spanish a little bit. I've lived in Spain a bit. But the Germans are. The Germans just tell you what they think. The same with
Yeah.
the Dutch. They're very direct. Even the Americans, I mean, the Americans have a kind of southern hospitality a lot of the time, but they're also quite direct, relatively speaking. But I think the English and perhaps the French, but definitely the English, are very into this kind of surface. And so you're then like, well, what's it hiding? That's the inevitable question that
Yeah.
comes from that,
Yes, yeah.
right?
Yeah. And you're
But
telling
I'm interested in what you think as well in Ireland, like how you see it. I mean, you said that immediately at the top of the interview, but I don't want to comment on Ireland. I've only been there once or twice. I don't want to
well, I
make
think
any sweeping statements about the island, but if you want to, I'd be interested to hear them.
well,